morning, kids. I just got to New York barely a week after Trump was here getting indicted for lying about the money that he paid to a porn star to keep her quiet about his affair while he was running for office. And it got me thinking about how the West views itself, especially countries like the US and the UK. Because we're civilized countries, right? We're better than those other non-English speaking countries in Asia, South America, or Africa with their dodgy elections, criminal leaders, and blatant human rights violations. I mean, here in the US, it's part of their widely accepted ideology that they're the greatest country on earth. And in the UK, we voted for Brexit after politicians convinced us that the EU needed us more than we needed them. Let me rephrase that. We were convinced that 30 countries would be more damaged by loss of trade with one country than our one country would be damaged by loss of trade with 30 countries. Which implies that we think Brits aren't just better than other people, but 30 times better. You are arguing that one country is needed by 27 countries more than 27 countries are needed by one country.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely right.
That would imply that that one country is inherently better than 27 countries combined.
Bang on! Congratulations, you've hit the nail on the head. We are the 5th largest economy.
And we know why that is. Our history classes are just a list of stories about how we won wars and invented shit. Nothing about the achievements of other countries, and in the UK, certainly nothing about the achievements of people from ethnic minorities within the UK. I mean, look at America right now. Trump might genuinely win the next election because he's been criminally indicted. And it's not like his supporters don't believe he paid off the porn star, but whether or not he's convicted, they'll still use that as a sign of how cool he is. A jury has already heard a recorded phone call of Trump demanding that a Secretary of State from Georgia fired an extra 11,780 votes so that he could win the election. But be honest, if you heard of an African, Asian, or a Russian politician doing exactly that, tell me a little part of you wouldn't be thinking, yeah, that confirms we're one of the better countries, we're the home of democracy. And in the UK, it's important to recognise that everything the government's done in the last 7 years has been justified using the 2016 Brexit vote. The name of their manifesto is Get Brexit Done. Their anti-refugee policies, like sending them to Rwanda, they say that's because people voted to take back control of our borders in 2016. And yet, it's a matter of public record that the winning side in that referendum overspent illegally by £449,000. Again, if you heard that an African country had a major vote and the winning side broke the rules in a 6-figure way, would you consider the regime that followed to be legitimate? What if during an election debate, the winning side set up a fake fact-checking account on Twitter using their verified corporate page? What if a couple of months before the election, they had a vote in Parliament on whether to lower the voting age to 16, which is already allowed in some parts of the country, and they said they weren't going to let young people vote because they would vote for the other party?
And whilst the age of voting should be a debate that we have in this country, to suddenly thrust upon us right now, when we know it'll probably favour one particular party, now's not the right time to do it.
Because once we start deciding who gets to vote based on who they're going to vote for, we are in full fascism territory. And what if they went even further, and once they were in power, they introduced new voter ID requirements whereby elderly travel cards would be considered a legitimate ID to allow you to vote, but young person's travel cards wouldn't? You'd think, what savages? That place needs some good old-fashioned regime change. We should probably invade them to save them from themselves. I mean, America's rolling back abortion rights, the UK is putting noise limits on protests, i.e. literally silencing the voices of opposition. But we're G7 economies, we're the richest in the world. Who's we though? Because in the US, 38 million people are living below the poverty line. In the UK, it's 13.4 million people, including 27% of all children in the UK. So how does that tally with us being such amazing economies? In the US, the top 1% has 15 times the wealth of the bottom 50% combined. In the UK, the top 1% has more wealth than the bottom 70% combined, making us the 4th most financially unequal country in Europe. But we still look down on countries in Africa and Asia. The US and the UK gained their economic superiority in part by robbing, colonizing, and enslaving those countries that we now look down on. But take a country like Nigeria, where my parents are from. They'll be the first to tell you that that country's a mess. But it's a mess for the same reasons that the UK's a mess. Widespread corruption at the top. One of the members of the UK House of Lords took £29 million from a deal for medical equipment that she organised during the pandemic, and that PPE didn't even work. One of the advisors of former PM Liz Truss set up a company and gave it a PPE contract worth £156 million, and that PPE didn't work either. And they weren't the only examples. Transparency International found that 99% of the COVID contracts awarded during the first year of the pandemic were awarded without any competition process to make sure that those companies could actually do the job. That's about £18 billion. And there was a special VIP lane for companies with known connections to the Conservative Party, a VIP lane that was later found to be illegal. And that party is still in power. Now imagine that level of corruption in a country like Nigeria with only a fraction of the financial resources. Because I've been to Nigeria a bunch of times, and what killed me wasn't just seeing the worst poverty I've ever seen in my life. Like, I can vividly remember seeing a guy crawling along the middle of the road with his elbow bent the other way, begging for money. And that was just a couple of miles outside of Lagos, the main city. But in the center of Lagos, you'd think you were in Los Angeles, or Miami, or even New York in the summer. All the best cars, gated mansions, beachfront properties with marinas close by. Because Nigeria has loads of resources, big oil, big lithium for car batteries. But just like here, it is a decision by those at the top not to share the wealth. And again, my parents think the democracy over there is too broken to be fixed with just a few tweaks around the edges. There needs to be a genuine revolution, a completely new system based on accountability, both political and criminal. But isn't that what we need here in the West too? Because a couple of tweaks on the sides isn't going to cut it. For example, most people in America want stricter gun control, regardless of what the Second Amendment says. Because as I've said before, if you're willing to let thousands of people die every year, including kids, because of your strict interpretation of an ancient text, that is the definition of religious extremism. And yet it doesn't change. Most people never wanted Trump. Most people voted for Hillary. And yet because of the Electoral College, Trump got elected in 2016 and was able to stack the Supreme Court with right-wingers, and 150 million women lost the federal protection of their right to control their own bodies. And in the UK, because of our voting system, the Conservatives have been in power for 47 of the last 77 years, even though the majority has voted for parties to the left of them in all but 3 elections in that time. Which means that on average, we get governments that are more right-wing than the people they supposedly represent. I mean, look who the Tory party is. They consistently vote to lower benefits and to let banks and billionaires get away with paying less tax, because that's who their members are. 63% of Conservative Party members are against the idea of spending money to help people out of poverty, compared to just 19% of the general population who feel that way. And 61% of Brits think the rich should pay more tax, and yet we remain the 4th most financially unequal country in Europe because the system keeps giving the Conservatives absolute power, despite them only ever getting a minority of the vote. So what's holding us back? It's our belief that we're better than everyone else. They say that pride comes before a fall, and that's true. It's our belief in our superiority that keeps us from feeling the need to fix what's broken in our society. We don't need to completely change the system. That's for other countries, the brown ones, in France, but that's just because they love to protest. But the reality is this: if all votes don't count equally, which they don't in the US or the UK, then politics will always be about gaming the system. Even political discourse itself will always come second to that, because even if you manage to convince the person you're debating, who's to say that their vote will even count in the end? And it's because votes don't count equally that we ended up with Trump, a loss of abortion rights, Brexit itself, and a government that's fundamentally opposed to the idea of financial equality, and which the United Nations says is deliberately trying to normalize white supremacy. And don't even get me started on climate change, because the Conservatives got 44% of the vote, but ended up with 56% of the elected politicians. Meanwhile, the Greens got 2.7% of the vote, but only got 0.15% of elected politicians. So when you compare seat share to vote share, that means the Conservative votes were worth 18 times more than Green votes. And given the Conservative Party's close links to the fossil fuel industry, tell me exactly how we solve the climate crisis when Conservative votes are worth 18 times more than Green votes. Not to mention the effect that that has on people's willingness to vote for smaller parties because they know their votes won't count. Which is why I reject the idea that the UK is a democracy, because if a party with a minority of the vote always gets a majority of the seats in your lawmaking institutions, that means they can do whatever they want without having to even talk to the parties voted for by the majority of voters. Which means the majority of votes in the UK literally mean nothing. You cannot call that a democracy with a straight face. We need to change our voting system to one based on proportional representation, and in my opinion, so does America. And America could probably do with having a look at that constitution of theirs and seeing if they can't amend it to ban major campaign financing from private donors or from organizations like the NRA. Because if I haven't made this clear already, we, ordinary people, are better than our politicians. We grew up with this idea that our politicians were the best of us, but we've all since learned that the exact opposite is the case. So we need a complete system change if we're actually going to tackle the problems that we face. And by definition, the system isn't going to like that. So you're going to get pushback from politicians and journalists telling you it can't happen, telling you to be patient, but we need to collectively say, fuck them. You see, for all the problems that social media creates, the one good thing, especially in recent years, is that we've been able to see how the other half of the planet lives. We've seen how much we have in common. We've seen that we face many of the same problems with the politicians that are holding us down. So we should be drawing inspiration from each other to fix those problems, not looking down on other countries like the older generations did. Have a great week.